Welcome one and all to yet another poorly voiced video featuring yours truly, Creeper. In my time in the Dragon Ball fandom, I've noticed a large emphasis on hand-drawn works, fan mangas and the like, Dragon Ball AF, Dragon Ball Sai, and Dragon Ball Steven Universe. With Dragon Ball generally being in a visual medium, it makes sense as to why such works would get attention and popularity. However, that popularity comes to overshadow the underappreciated forms of fan stories, the text-based ones. Text-based fanfictions have a stigma for always being awful. While, yes, many of these stories are as badly structured and written as people think, there are quite a few stories that are the opposite. Today we'll take a brief look at one of these stories, Dragon Ball Z: The Forgotten, and attempts to shed a brighter light on this side of the fandom, point out where it avoids common fanfiction pitfalls, and give it more recognition. I should note that there will be some small spoilers for this story, for the sake of not leaving it as a basic plot summary. So if you're already interested by just the title, you can go check it out now with a link in the description. This is the story about the long-lost childhood friend of Vegeta and his quest to find him. Ledas is his name, and speed is not his game because his journey to reunite with Vegeta goes from before planned Vegeta's destruction and ends shortly after the Buu arc, all meant to fit in the main continuity of the show. And I do mean a journey. This tale is relatively long at over 166,000 words, or 333 pages if you so prefer, with a total of 6 arcs, 3 out in Frieza and Cooler's territory, and 3 on Earth. All of it goes towards the Saiyan's main goal. I think having such a focus on the protagonist is commendable, considering how many stories I've seen that seem to focus more on previously established characters and new villains, rather than said hero's journey. Well, maybe hero's journey isn't quite the correct term, because Ledas isn't really a hero in the traditional sense. For the first 2 arcs, he works for either Frieza or Cooler, conquering planets and killing rebels against their empire. It isn't for the sake of either emperor, since he's too weak to fight against them and actively avoids hurting innocent natives, which he relates to, but he's still serving them despite this. Even after he breaks free from their shackles by the 4th arc, he is still far from being the most stand-up person. He still kills innocent people on Earth because of his inability to confront Vegeta, and doesn't really seem to care that much about doing so. He still fights against evil, but less because of an active desire to stop such threats, instead due to being forced into a situation where he has to fight such evils. While he achieves his goal in the end, and is therefore tamed, as it were, he still stands as a morally grey character. What are such evils, you may or not be asking? Well, there's Frieza and Cooler, as I said, but neither are antagonists for Ledas to fight and beat. If you're worried that he pushed Frieza or Cooler to use a substantial amount of their power, you shouldn't, because the best he was able to do was push Cooler to a whopping less than 1% of his power. Yeah. Their roles are mainly as the person Ledas works for, rather than these are the evil emperors who Ledas is gonna stop. The focus instead is placed on the fan-made antagonists, ones that I feel are expertly crafted. I'll try to keep it brief by talking about what I feel are the main antagonists throughout the story, rather than all of them. The first main villain introduced, besides Frieza, and what can be considered to be our protagonist's arch-enemy, is the reclusive, the Benefactor. Yeah, he's so reclusive, he isn't even given a real name, and instead uses the title bestowed to him by Frieza. What's interesting about him, at least in terms of Dragon Ball, is that he's an incredibly active antagonist. Ledas doesn't take him out for the sake of a good fight or to get revenge. It's always the Benefactor that's on the offensive, trying to find him and take what he feels is rightfully his. It's only at the end of the series where the two are truly on equal footing with each other, which I feel makes their dynamic more interesting. Then there's Banas and Guva, a captain and governor of Cooler's army. What I find interesting about these two is less so their direct relationship with our hero, but more so how they try to use the Saiyan for their own selfish desires and trying to get an upper hand on one another. Yeah, that means villain versus villain dynamics, baby. Who doesn't love a good villain versus villain dynamic? Furthermore, the two are a representation of Ledas not being able to break free from tyrannical shackles, since he's basically forced to join Banas' squad of fighters, and just generally being a pawn in Guva's machinations. They give an interesting, impressive atmosphere within the 2nd arc, with the effects drifting on for many arcs to come. The titular villain of the 2nd arc is next up, and he's similar to a certain Green Man, and predates said Greenlee figure. I don't want to go too into specifics because most of his stuff goes into big spoiler territory, but I have to say I think his reasoning for destroying mortals is more nuanced and grey than Zamasu's. On Earth, there's the new Red Ribbon Army. Now, these people don't have yet another strong super powerful android to conquer the world with or anything, or have a super strong guy as their leader. They're political figures at this point, covering up events like the Saiyan attack and trying to stop Ledas from destroying the Earth, or something like that. They have some soldiers and some decently strong guns, and yet they still feel like a tangible threat, through deducing where Ledas and his new Earth friend Riori are, and tranquilizing the alien with one of their bullets while he's not on guard. Also, their leader Cardinal, an alias, is on good terms with King Furry, which is nice. And finally there's Verlaine, an all-powerful being above the Kais, eternally trapped in a mind prison. She's more of a trickster kind of antagonist who just wants to be free of her prison, and in that way you kinda feel bad for her. So don't be worried, Ledas doesn't magically gain the powers to beat her. That's kinda the way it is with the villains and new characters as a whole in the series. They're balanced in their power. The Benefactor doesn't start out at Super Saiyan 3 Goku level, he starts out around half as strong as Frieza's first form. Ledas doesn't start with Super Saiyan, stronger than Frieza. He takes half the story to even obtain Super Saiyan. Banas and Guva are only around 1 million, Lauto and Verlaine don't focus on overpowering their opponents, and the new Red Ribbon Army, well, that speaks for itself. They're all pretty balanced power-wise, and don't go above the threshold of unrealistic power-ups. Additionally, the villains don't get a big bombastic fight with Ledas at the end of the arc. They're put in place for the sake of organically expanding the Dragon Ball universe. A lot of it is infighting with villains, so if you're looking for the big old this story may not be for you. However, do not fret, for there is still quite a number of fights within this tale, and yes, even a few big climactic end of arc fights. Now, this not being in a visual medium, I feel makes it a bit harder to fully grasp and connect with the choreography. It's even harder to articulate what I find nice about said fights, aside from saying, I can imagine the choreography, and most of the fights have a good pace for them. The third arc especially has a lot of fights happening one after another, which I personally feel gets a bit tiring after a while, but certainly feels closest to that Dragon Ball stereotype of it being bombastic fights and nothing else. I feel the fights certainly aren't the feature of this fable, but the majority of it isn't bad and written quite well, all things considered. Perhaps I should have noted the writing quality before anything else, but yes, the prose and writing as a whole are very well done, with a few little touches to add to its uniqueness. The main unique point is that all of it, aside from one special, is written in script format, making it much quicker to read than a typical book, and easily separating dialogue from the descriptive or fighting bits. I feel it works well with the Dragon Ball rhythm, as it were, when there are clear cutoff points for fighting and dialogue. The text is also colored differently for every single arc, which is a good idea. I have to say, if you have trouble reading the text, which I certainly did at points, if you highlight the text, it'll be black with a light blue backdrop, which I find much easier to be on the eyes. Finally, every arc has a musical theme, and there are a few points within the story that indicates the reader to turn on specific music tracks. The indicated points may exclude slow readers a bit, but otherwise I think it's another good light addition to make it all the more unique. As I've alluded to before, the story itself features many unique aspects, even aside from its writing style. It does a pretty great job of expanding the Dragon Ball universe from previously established concepts. We see more of how the Saiyans trained, way more of Cooler's empire and infrastructure, even more grounded aspects on Earth like school and the previously mentioned government cover-up of alien attacks, and brief looks at even more gods. There isn't just the same fanfiction tropes of a villain coming to Earth in the first arc and being super strong. It really tries to be something new and exploratory. That means a lot of the typical Dragon Ball cast isn't featured super heavily in this story. Every character does get a small moment to shine, but most of them don't even show up until the second to last arc and barely impact Ledas' narrative. Vegeta, while the main goal he has to strive towards, feels a bit like a plot device in his role, rather than a super important character to the plot itself. Though he does get a relatively fan-servicey moment near the end of the second to last arc. In return, emphasis is placed on underappreciated characters in the Z Saga, Yajirobe and Karin. Those two really get their time in the sun, which I really like. It's not afraid to throw away characters we've seen already develop for arcs on end, and not risk ruining them or having them be a lesser form of the actual Dragon Ball arcs by placing a major focus on them. It decides to have an entirely new take on the franchise, which heavily plays to its strengths. Before concluding this, I should say there are a few instances of gore and adult themes. I don't think it's done excessively or simply for the sake of shock value, so it isn't a major detriment, but if you're queasy for that sort of thing, seeing this one out might be a good idea. This whole adventure is ambitious, especially in the main theme it tries to tell, being forgotten. Aside from the characters, which is a whole bag of worms I'd rather you conclude for yourself, this being a fanfiction that has little to no chance of actually being adapted into canon, has the characters, in a meta way, being forgotten entirely by the main cast of Dragon Ball. At the very least, I hope this video will make it so that the story isn't truly forgotten by everyone.